No, this webinar is being relayed from our PGR headquarters, which is based in Troy, Michigan. And my name is Sharda Rao, and I am the Assistant Program Manager at PGR. I am essentially responsible for managing the ISO 14000, the BS 18000, the recycling standards R2 and RoHS for PGR, and I've been doing this almost for 10 years for the company. The audience that we have participating today is really coming from a wide range of organizations as well as consulting groups. We also have some potential auditors and potential organizations choosing to or wanting to get certified to ISO 14001 in the near future. Now, if you have any questions, you can certainly on the side where you have the ability to put in the GoToMeeting chat screen, you can put in any questions that you have. Since I will be the only speaker today, I won't be able to answer the questions as I speak, but certainly we'll reserve about 10-15 minutes at the end of the session to be able to address any concerns or questions that you may have. Today's session will be roughly an hour. The first 40 to 45 minutes, I will walk through all the various slides that would highlight the importance of ISO 14001, how it would benefit an organization by implementing such a system. And then towards the end of the session, as I mentioned, I will then go through all the questions that you've put into the chat screen so that we can address those as well. And if in case we run out of time, we can certainly address some of these questions separately where you can email me the information, and I can certainly interact with you on a one-on-one basis. Now, Perry-Johnson Registrar has really been around for a while, and over the years, I would say in the last 20 years, we've been one of the leaders as far as the ISO 14001 standard is concerned. Now, ISO 14001 stands for the Environmental Management System Standard, and this is just one of the many different accreditations and certifications that we offer through our company. Although our headquarters is based in Michigan, in Troy, we have our presence almost all over the world in all the various continents, including countries like Brazil, Italy. We have a very, very large operation in Japan and India, and then we also have certain satellite offices in Malaysia and Singapore, and certainly a big presence here in the United States as well as in Mexico. And as our programs continue to develop, we're finding that we're entering new markets every year. Now, PGR, as I mentioned, doesn't only work with ISO 14001. We really work with a number of different standards, and some of these are listed here. Obviously, the most common one being the ISO 9001 standard, which is the quality management systems. Apart from this, we've made a lot of headway in the areas of aerospace, in the recycling industry standards, which include R2, as well as the recycling industry operating standard, otherwise known as RoHS. Apart from this, we also work with food standards, as well as responsible care, which is applicable for the chemical industry and oil industry, and information security, which is ISO 27001. But today's webinar is really going to focus on the ISO 14001 standard, or otherwise known as Environmental Management System. ISO 14001 is really an internationally recognized standard. It has been around for a while, and it's a standard that really outlines how a company can not only establish but implement and operate an environmental management system. So you may ask yourself, what is an environmental management system? In short, we always say EMS, and it's basically nothing more than a framework or the foundation that the organization develops in order to control all the impacts the organization's activities has in the environment, how to be able to use the management system to reduce the risk of pollution incidents, and ensuring that there's a consistent compliance to environmental legislation, and sometimes going beyond that using your EMS. And the bottom line is, in the long run, we expect that the EMS will help an organization to improve its processes as well as its operations. The standard originally came out in 1996, and It was revised again in 2004, and we do anticipate that the standard will be undergoing its third revision this year, probably closer to the end of the year. So we anticipate that the transition that the companies will have to make will be from 2015 onwards to the new ISO 14001 standard. It's still very much a standard that's considered voluntary, meaning that there is no requirement either by governments or states or any other organizations that are forced to become ISO 14001 certified because of a requirement. For the most part, most people choose to do it because they want to express a certain image in the industry of being green. And sometimes it could be a customer requirement because we know a lot of Japanese companies do require that their downstream vendors are ISO 14001 so that it enhances the image of the parent company. Apart from this standard itself, which is the ISO 14001-2004 standard, when companies are implementing the system, they also make use of the guidance document, the ISO 14004-2004 document. This is something that's outside of the actual standard itself, but what it really does is it highlights how an organization can meet all the different requirements that are highlighted in the main standard, giving examples and sort of going into a little bit more depth about what each requirement actually means. There's another document that organizations use in order to develop an EMS, which is the 19,011 guidance document. The 19,011 guidance document, again, is just a guidance document, but it gives you ideas about how to qualify your internal auditors, how to develop an internal audit program. So it really goes into depth about your system itself and how to make sure that your internal audit system works for you in managing your EMS. Now, just like 9001, for those of you who may be familiar with the quality management system, the ISO 14001 standard also follows the typical foundation of a plan, do, check, act cycle. So what does that mean?
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
So the point is that here we have the Plan, Do, Check, Act, which is PDCA in short. This is what makes up the foundation of the 14001 standard. So basically, a company begins the process of, when they start with their EMS, they first have to plan for developing this EMS. This includes developing an environmental policy. It includes developing the environmental aspects. It also includes developing, a list of legal and other requirements, as well as objectives and targets, etc. So once that planning process is done, that sort of lays the foundation of how their EMS is going to look. And then once that's completed, they actually have to implement it. So this is the do stage. So this is when they have to identify the resources, roles, and responsibilities for individuals undertaking all the different tasks under the EMS, making sure that they have competence, making sure that they get the necessary training if there's a deficiency in competence, and just making their staff aware of the requirements of the EMS and how they can contribute towards it, towards making it successful. Then, of course, making sure the internal as well as external communication is completely secure, so that there is smooth flow of information within the organization and with outside the organization as well. Making sure that all the documentation requirements, and there's obviously a good control of how documents are managed within the organization. All that is taken care of during the implementation phase. Some companies may still choose to use everything via hard copies, but most of our organizations are in the electronic age when everything is controlled by the IT, and we have servers to back up information. So all that information should be captured under 4.4.5, which is control of documents. If there are any significant aspects, then obviously the company has to come up with controls to make sure that all those impacts are managed in an effective manner. And then finally making sure that there's a good system for emergency preparedness and response. So in the event of a fire or any major emergency, the company is in a good state to respond to it without any damage, not only to the property, but also to any damage to to equipment, or employee health and safety is also equally important. Once all this implementation is completed, the next stage is really to check and see if that system that you've developed really works for you. So this is when you have to make sure that you monitor and measure parameters that you've set in place for any of your programs, making sure that you're consistently evaluating that the organization is compliant to the legal and other requirements. Making sure that if something is falling out of place, you have an incident, you have a situation, how is that put through your corrective action process, making sure that that's raised as a nonconformity so that you don't have that problem again recurring at the facility. And then making sure there's a control of records. How do you manage it? Once a record is created, you have all this documentation that exists. How do you either dispose of it? How do you, store it? Do you have servers that can back up everything? So control of records is a very big part of an organization's management setup. And finally, also making sure that you do an internal audit. An internal audit is basically a systems audit that you do for yourself, for your organization, to ensure that all the requirements of ISO 14001 are met through your management system. And obviously any deficiencies arising from that would then be captured through your nonconformity and corrective and preventive action process, so you don't have that problem again recurring. Once the checking part is done, you then have the management review. This is really the final stage. And when we say management review, it's really getting together your top management and making sure that they're aware of how your system's been developed, how it's progressing, how it's meeting the requirements, what issues you had. All of that is discussed during the management review. So that way, everybody in the organization is truly aware of what's happening with the 14001 system in place. So the whole cycle goes on repeating on a year-to-year basis, and through this process, we expect to see continual improvement. New programs, maybe going over and above what the legal requirements require of you. So making sure that that continues and that the system works for you. What are some of the benefits of getting certified? Why do organizations do this? Because it's still a voluntary standard. There's nobody forcing a company to be certified unless it's a customer requirement. For the most part, a lot of companies choose to get certified just so they can acquire additional bids and stay ahead of the competition, because it gives them the image of being green. It looks good in the marketplace. It also, in the long run, through many of the programs that you implement, reduces resource use like energy, water, through different programs that you may have in place. There may be waste disposal costs that are reduced because you have better programs in managing and recycling your waste that are generated at the plant. Obviously, this will result in a reduction in pollution overall and how much is actually going to the landfills. Certainly for many companies, the priority is because they have to meet a certain customer requirement or an interested party requirement. Maybe if you have to take a membership with an organization, an industry organization in a country, wherever it may be, they may require you to be ISO 14001 certified in order to get their membership. And finally, through the process of continual improvement, you're going to find that there's so many benefits that come out of the programs that a lot of companies choose to stay certified to 14001 despite other pressures of maybe meeting customer requirements. They just see the long-term benefits of getting such a certification. You also find that obviously both on a domestic and international level, we talked about the fact that a lot of companies like to project that they're a green company. A company that's really trying to make a difference to the, to the community around them, to the environment around them, which, as we know, is a big deal in today's world. Overall, through all the programs, we find that it drives performance improvement and also improves efficiency. Now, one of the things is while companies do a pretty good job of trying to manage compliance to legal requirements, ISO 14001 makes you take a second look at it and a much more detailed look at it, because it forces you to do a periodic evaluation to your legal requirements. So overall, you might see a reduced liability through fines or any other potential issues that you may face with federal and state agencies. One particular issue that we've seen as being a huge benefit to organizations is the tracking of legal requirements. I wanted to focus on this primarily because most companies see a tremendous benefit of being 14001 certified, because they get a better grip and handle over their tracking of or management of their legal requirements. Now, EMS auditors are really not compliance officers. So we're not from any agency, federal agency or state agency that's coming to check and see if you have managed all your legal requirements and are following it to the T per the law. What we're really trying to do is just to make sure that you have a system in place that ensures that you're doing a good job in tracking what you need to meet in terms of environmental legislation. So in no way does 14,001 replace the legislative requirements. It just enhances how you're looking at your own environmental legislation. It also has the advantage of focusing on what we call other requirements. So this sort of goes beyond just environmental legislation, but focuses on areas like customer requirements. Maybe there are certain insurance requirements that are related to your environmental aspects that need to be looked at, requirements of any trade associations or commitments that you've made to the headquarters of a parent organization. All these things also have to be taken into account when you're talking about 14,001. So you're really giving it a very comprehensive and a concise look at all the requirements that you have to meet, not just from the environmental legislation standpoint, but it goes beyond that, anything that's related to your significant aspects. Since it does require an evaluation of compliance under 4.5.2, you find that you'll end up catching a lot of things that your employees may not be doing correctly to meet a legal requirement, and then that way you can put it through a corrective action process and not have the problem occur. This could potentially save a company from having to pay hefty fines if in fact a federal or a state agency were there to audit you. And if they see reports like this, it actually benefits your organization because it shows that they're committed to really trying to manage their legal requirements. The other thing that's very important for companies, which we find is being a huge benefit to organizations, is the fact that you have to develop environmental objectives, targets, and programs. So really here, a program is considered, this comes under 4.3.3 of the EMS system in 14,001. So a program is something that an organization has to develop that goes beyond just meeting your legal requirements or something that you have done in the absence of the standard. So you're looking at certain things, it's something that will constantly change because you have to demonstrate continual improvement. You cannot just have one program and not change it for years on end if you're certified to 14,001. We expect it to be dynamic. We expect it to be something that will result in savings for the organization, as well as perhaps conservation of resources. So maybe you might find a new process that would alter how much water is being used in the plant. So that in the long run will result in tremendous savings, not just from the water perspective, but in terms of a monetary perspective as well. Programs also do require that every function of the organization is in some way involved. So we're not just looking at the programs that you develop for the plant itself on the shop floor. We're talking about programs developed at the front office, at the lab areas, or in other parts of the plant, even outside. So we're looking at different departments and functions of the organization when we're developing this program. So you're really involving the whole organization when creating a new environmental objective or program. They have to be measurable. So when I say measurable, it's not something where you cannot put numbers to it. You must be able to measure it. You must be able to quantify it, be able to show trends, be able to show graphs about how you're achieving your goal, etc. So that way you can clearly see what benefits you're deriving from implementing a specific program. We've also seen that by implementing some of these programs, insurance premiums have also been reduced because some of these programs are directly related to meeting certain insurance requirements. And we've had a couple of companies in the past tell us that their premiums have actually gone down as a result of implementing good environmental programs. Some typical examples we've seen of environmental programs include, obviously, the big one, which is energy conservation. So monitoring your electrical consumption, ensuring that you have programs in place in the organization that would truly reduce how much the company is consuming electricity in the long run. Water conservation, certainly there are many programs. Rainwater harvesting is a big program that we see companies implementing, capturing rainwater and using it for purposes like the bathroom, so that way you don't use your regular water supply. So that could reduce how much water you're using in the long run. Recycling, of course, by far is the most popular, including paper, cardboard, plastic, whatever it is that you generate through your operations that could technically be recycled can be put through these programs. And then, of course, going beyond compliance. Just meeting a legal requirement cannot be an environmental program, because in the absence of the standard, you would have to do that anyway. So it has to go beyond that. So maybe you're changing a certain waste treatment process, or if you change a certain raw material, then the amount of waste that you actually have to treat becomes less, and maybe your limits that way get extended. Or you may, if they say, okay, you have to maintain a certain ppm for suspended solids, let's say it's 10 ppm, and that you decide we're going to go beyond that and reduce our suspended solids even more, that could be considered a program. So there are really different ways of coming up with these things, and a lot of times companies are already implementing programs that they could use as part of their EMS. Now, the next part of this is really to talk about what it takes to be certified to the ISO 14001 standard. So we talked a little bit about the foundation of the 14001 standard, what are some of the benefits and how, it really benefits an organization to be certified, and what would prompt a company to be certified. We're now going to talk about what it takes to be actually certified itself. What are some of the things that you need to put in place to get an ISO 14001 certificate? So the first thing is making sure that you have all the documentation that meets the 14001 requirements. So at multiple levels, you're going to see from 4.1 through 4.6 of the standard, there are different levels of documentation that you require to meet all those requirements. Now, once that's in place, if you already have other systems in place, like perhaps 9001 or R2, the recycling programs, or 18001, which is the occupational health and safety program, you could potentially integrate your 14001 with those systems. And when I say integrate, it basically means that you're combining the documentation for 14 with all the other standards that you may already have. Once all this documentation is created, you then want to ensure that your staff and your members of the company are really trained to all these different requirements. And then you'll implement those requirements. So making sure that you conduct the internal audits of your system, making sure there's an evaluation to compliance for legal requirements, making sure that whatever inputs you get, whatever outputs you get from an internal audit are then relayed and communicated to your management through the management review process. So once you kind of have all this down and the foundation in place, and you've begun the process of implementing it and testing to see if the system works for you, you can then be ready, you're then ready to basically contract with a certification body. So a certification body, somebody like PGR, would essentially come in to verify if in fact what you've developed for your EMS really matches the 14001 requirements. So we would then come in and do your registration audit, which is essentially divided into two parts, the stage 1 and stage 2 audit. And if everything is satisfactory, we would then provide you with the certification. Now, prior to stage 1, in the certification process, PGR will conduct a cursory review of the documentation. So the registration audit, like I mentioned, is divided into stage 1 and stage 2. So it's really a two-part process. The stage 1 audit is really the documentation review process, or documentation review stage. So at this stage, we're really looking at all your policies and procedures and all the paperwork that you've put together in order to meet the requirements. So prior to even beginning that process, we actually do an off-site, that means a review in-house here, where I take a quick look at what you have in place prior to the auditor actually visiting your location and doing the stage 1 audit. This ensures that the company is truly ready to proceed to stage 1. And if we find that there are serious, major documents that are missing and serious issues with the system, we would actually postpone the audit till the organization is ready. So at the stage 1, it's really more a conference. I call it typically a conference room audit, because most of the time the auditor spends time at the conference room, outside, of course, the site tour that he would typically do, but reviewing everything that you have in terms of paperwork to ensure that you're ready to proceed to the stage 2. Now, if there are any nonconformities that come out of this audit, then certainly you would have time to fix it. Usually it's between 30 to 75 days that you would have to fix these nonconformities depending on the seriousness of the issues. But for the most part, most clients are able to schedule their stage 2 audit 30 to 45 days after their stage 1 audit. The stage 2 audit is what we call the implementation audit. So it's really a two-part process. Not only do we look at a quick look at all the documentation to make sure nothing's changed since stage 1, but at this point we are really looking at to see if you've implemented your system based off of everything that you have on your paperwork. So have you conducted your fire drills? Have you trained your staff? Do you have records for all of that? You know, have you tested your system for emergency preparedness? So a number of different things we look at, and there's minimal time in the conference room, and there's more time spent on the facility floor, talking to people, interviewing, you know, looking into recycling bins, and really surveying the area. Now, again, any nonconformities that arise from this audit, you would have up to 60 days to close it out. And if all is satisfactory, then we would certainly go ahead and issue the certificate. But if there's something that's still considered open or serious enough, sometimes we will come out and do what's called a revisit audit, meaning that we revisit your facility to ensure that we can close out everything that we've written up at the stage 2 audit. But most clients are pretty good about meeting that 60-day deadline, and we're able to issue the certificate without any issues. So this basically constitutes the registration audit. This is the first part of the process. And we will issue you a 3-year certificate. And during that period, obviously, we expect that there has to be a maintenance of your system. So it's not that we will never visit you. In fact, either on a 6-month or on an annual basis, we come out to your facility to do what's called a partial system audit. So we will look at all your processes and at every one of these surveillances, but we'll pick and choose certain processes that we want to audit at each of these surveillance to see that you're truly maintaining your system within that 3-year cycle. Once that 3-year certificate is up for renewal, at that stage we do what's called a reassessment or a recertification audit. So really, this is something that would sort of reassess how the organization has performed over the last 3 years. Has it been good, or has there been consistent improvement? And then we would then conduct this recertification audit on site, which is usually 2/3 the registration time. But basically, we're not only looking at documentation, but we're looking at implementation at the same time. Because by this time, we expect that the system is mature enough that they can be audited in one go. So we're not dividing it as a stage 1 and stage 2 audit. So once that recertification audit is conducted, we would then continue with the surveillance audit cycle. So really, once again, depending on what the organization chooses, it would be annual or semi-annual. And sometimes PGR will decide if it's going to be an annual or semi-annual audit, depending on the performance of the organization in the previous 3 years. So if the company's had a really bad history and just hasn't done a good enough job, but has been in an annual cycle in the first 3 years, PGR may go back and say, hey, we're going to change that to a semi-annual until you get back on track, and then we can switch back to an annual once everything is smoothed over. So it sort of really depends also on the performance of the organization. Now, not all companies are just single sites or standalone companies. We have many, many organizations that we've certified that are really where they have a parent company at one location and several locations all across a geographical region, or it could be anywhere in the world. So we call these typically as multi-site certifications, where basically we have one headquarters, so what we call is the parent company that really sort of manages all the other locations and where the top management resides. And then we have multiple locations, but all these locations essentially do the same activity. So as an organization, you may be manufacturers of plastic products. Most of the locations will manufacture plastic products, and the headquarters is really the decision-making location. The certification bodies like PGR are able to offer what's called as a multi-site certificate. So essentially, it's a corporate certificate where all the other sites are listed in the appendix. The advantage of having a multi-site certification is that we're allowed to sample between all the locations that fall under the certificate. So we don't have to hit every location at every audit. we can actually pick and choose because all these sites do the same thing. We can say, we'll visit these 2 locations in this audit. We'll visit the other 2 locations at another audit. So this saves the company a significant amount monetarily because the expenses are reduced for auditors to fly out to every location. And, you know, it certainly cuts down how much they have to spend on auditing. It also will give them a reduction in the demand days or how much time we would need to spend at these locations if the same auditor visits all the locations. Because there's familiarity with the system, we don't have to fly out. I mean, we don't have to necessarily train the lead auditor every time to audit the locations because he's familiar with the whole company's setup. So as a policy, we typically give a significant discount to companies that have multi-site certifications and use the same lead auditor for auditing all those different locations. The only con, I would say, with the multi-site certification is if, in fact, any one of the sites falters or basically kind of falls off the wagon as far as maintaining their system, unfortunately, the entire certification is then in jeopardy. So if one site is suspended, the entire group will be suspended because essentially they all come under one certificate. So some companies are a little scared of that. So as a result, they try to take single-site certifications. But from an economic standpoint, it certainly makes sense to have management of all the sites and making sure that you just have one corporate certificate. Now, PGR has been in the auditing business a very, very long time. So we've come across some typical nonconformities that companies derive from, from auditing, basically. One of the biggest issues we see is an incomplete list of environmental aspects. So the standard under 4.3.1 does require an organization to list out all the aspects, meaning the impacts that arise from the different activities, products, and services that the company has in place, to identify what those aspects and impacts are. But most of the time, you find that they don't consider all the departments and functions of the organization. They tend to focus only on the facility floor or the major operations of the facility. They tend to leave out the front desk area. They leave out the lab. They may leave out the warehouse. So just by doing the walkthrough during the audit, we end up finding out that there are a whole bunch of aspects that the organization has left out in the course of coming up with their EMS. The other thing is an incomplete list of legal requirements. So here we have companies that obviously will detail and label all their environmental legislation, but unfortunately they tend to miss out the other requirements that we talked about, which essentially go beyond environmental legislation. It could be things like the wood packaging rules, it could be RoHS requirements that they have to meet. So all those, especially if they are concerned with their significant aspects and impacts, they have to be identified in the legal listing. So this is often a deficiency we see with a lot of companies that are just getting certified. Certainly an incomplete or an ineffective compliance evaluation. So for the most part, companies get confused between doing an internal audit and a compliance evaluation. They think it's really just one and the same, but it's not. An internal audit is one that looks at you auditing your system against the 14001 standard requirements, whereas a compliance evaluation is one that requires an organization to look at their own system against the actual environmental legislation, federal, state, district level, legislation that you may have to meet. So it's really two different compliances, or evaluations that you need to be doing. And oftentimes either it's missing, or it's ineffective, or it's incomplete. And when I say ineffective, we would be walking through the facility and we would find a box of universal waste like fluorescent tubes, but there's no label on it, just because they've missed that out in their checklist when they do the compliance evaluation. That's one of the typical things we see. So while we audit to the 14,000 system, these are some of the things that we can capture in our audit to let you know if in fact you have a complete or an incomplete compliance evaluation. And finally, effectiveness of corrective and preventive actions. Most companies do a very good job of identifying the nonconformities that arise from their internal audit or their external audit, like a PGR audit, and putting it through their own corrective action process. but they don't really consider some of the day-to-day issues that they may be facing. There may be a serious breakdown of an equipment that could cause a spill. Putting that through the corrective action process would ensure that that never happens again. And a lot of companies fail to put those kinds of issues through their own corrective and preventive action process. They tend to just focus on the physical audits that are done either internally or by an external agency like PGR. The other thing that I commonly hear, having done this for a long time, one of the complaints, or some of the complaints that I hear especially from new clients, is firstly too much documentation. So really, the 14001 will specify in the standard what documents you specifically need. So it's not like every single requirement needs for you to have a documented procedure, but most companies choose to do it just so it reminds them on what they need to do to meet those requirements. But it can get cumbersome if a company doesn't really understand the requirement and overdoes it as far as the documentation is concerned. And initially, yes, most companies, when they're getting their foot in the door as far as 14,000 is concerned, they will end up creating a lot of extra documentation that they may not necessarily need because they truly don't understand the requirements. But as this company progresses in maturity with respect to their EMS, you find that the documentation actually gets more and more concise and consolidated. So you really don't find too much documentation. And if you have a good system where you manage everything online and you share the information online, it really doesn't seem as cumbersome as if you had a whole bunch of hard copies like we used to have in the old days. Too expensive. I agree, initially it is expensive because you are getting into the system. You may or may not even have the resources to do many of the things to help you develop the system. So you may need to bring in a consultant to help you, whether it's to do a compliance evaluation or just help you put the whole system together. That's a pretty big chunk of investment that you have to make. But again, as you mature and as you understand as an organization the EMS itself and how it works for you, you may no longer need a consultant within a year or two of implementing the system. So it really sort of depends on how much resource you actually have within the company to dedicate in managing the EMS. But most companies wean off of a consultant after a year or two of being certified just because they understand their system and they know how to manage it without having any external help. Some companies will choose to keep a consultant, especially when it comes to compliance evaluation or doing internal audits, just because they like to have somebody from the outside come in and take a look rather than having an internal person who's been working with the system all year long, conduct an audit. Too complicated. Once again, this will change as maturity of the system comes in place. It seems like there's a lot that needs to be covered with the 14,001 standard, but as you progress, as the company develops maturity with respect to the EMS, you'll find that you can actually simplify the system so as to make it work for you. I think if you have too much documentation, sometimes it does get complicated. There's a lot of overlapping procedures. The same thing said in 5 different ways in 5 different documents. So all those things sort of get reduced in terms of documentation over time, and it really comes from understanding the requirements of the standard. As we work with standards, you're going to see that companies having just a standalone 14,000 is no longer an option. Most companies have more than one system working for them. So not only are they certified to 14,001, but you find that they also have a 9,001 system. And if they're a recycler of e-waste, they may have an R2 certificate, they may have a RIO certificate, or if they're doing neither of these recycling, they may be a construction company that requires them to be certified to 18,000. The advantage today is that all these standards are very easily integratable. So the way the standards have been designed is that many of these elements are the same between the standards, so the requirements really overlap. So that way you can essentially have one documentation system for all of the standards that you're basically subscribing to. And I've listed some of these below, but it gives us an advantage here at PJR to be also able to discount how much time we spend on-site at your facilities when we do these integrated audits. So an integrated audit is not just one where you do them back-to-back. So it's a 14 first and then 18 R2 and RIOs. You're actually doing when you integrate them, I'm looking at the internal audit for all the standards in one sitting. I'm looking at the management review for all the standards in one sitting. It's because there's only one document that I need to look at that covers multiple standards. So a lot of clients will get confused. They don't understand what a combined audit is versus an integrated audit. In a combined audit, we're just doing it at the same time, but none of the documents are integrated. And we have two different management representatives for the two standards that are being audited, whereas in an integrated system, there'll be just one management representative for both the standards and one documentation manual and other procedures for both the standards. So we're able to discount pretty significantly. It starts at about 20% for each standard if they're being integrated. So that reduces how much time we spend on site and certainly reduces how much an organization has to pay to have an auditor on site to audit such an integrated standard. Now, definitely there's certain requirements that have to be met when we audit to integrated standards. So firstly, your internal auditors have to be qualified in all the standards that are being integrated by your organization. So it has to be, if you have a 9 and a 14,001 system, the internal auditor has to be trained in both systems to be able to do an integrated audit. There has to be one corrective action system to manage all the nonconformities that arise. Whether it's 14 or 9 or whatever standard, there's only one corrective action process that's in place. There's only one management review process that would address all the inputs and outputs of all these different standards. So you have maybe one meeting every year that discusses all the deficiencies you faced with these different standards. You have one set of policies and procedures and one manual that addresses these standards, one management representative, one program to handle supplier and subcontractors that you may be using, especially with respect to significant aspects and hazards. Having a simple, one single compliance audit. We talked about evaluation to legal compliance, just having one system in place that would manage compliance to legal requirements, whether it's OSHA or whether it's the EMS standard. And of course, most of the time, it's just one individual handling the programs for these multiple standards. If we find that, a company says, hey, we're integrated, we have everything in place, but then if PGR goes on site and finds that it's not an integrated system, in fact, there are different systems for different standards, then unfortunately we have to remove any discount that we've given the company moving forward. So keep in mind the difference between a simultaneous or a combined audit and an integrated audit. So a simultaneous audit is just doing, conducting the audit simultaneously between the standards. But an integrated audit requires work on the organization's part because they actually have to integrate all the documents between the standards being integrated. So we've ended a little bit early. Just wanted to see if there are any questions that you may have with respect to our webinar today. This is my contact information that I just wanted to share. My phone number is listed there with my extension, and certainly my email is also available for anyone who may choose to email me after this session. But you can either call me or email me. I'm available both ways, and I often get a lot of emails from potential auditors or clients or consultants, usually after the webinar, sometimes days after the webinar. So feel free to do that. But if you're interested in getting a quote for being certified to 14001, feel free to call our headquarters, which then they would connect you to the respective sales division to help you get ready for a quote. And there are specific forms that need to be filled out to begin that process for being certified to the 14001 standard. So I'm just going to look through my chat screen to see if there are any questions that may be identified on the screen. Please bear with me just for a moment. trying to get a hold of all the questions we have. Unfortunately, I don't have the access to it, so I'm trying to get it from our webinar team here. So just a moment. So it appears that the first few minutes were lost. Some individuals weren't able to listen. There really wasn't much. It was just an introduction to PGR. So really it started from the PDCA cycle, so you really didn't miss much initially. There's a question that says, how much of OSHAS is expected to be included in ISO 14001? With the inclusion of the new standard coming out this year, 2014 or 15 version, we expect that it will be a standard that's going to be able to be far more capable of being integrated with the 18001 standard. So I don't necessarily see health and safety requirements being incorporated in the standard. There's obviously a fine line sometimes when we look at legal requirements. Sometimes we have to cross over to OSHA requirements if it's related to their environmental aspects. But for the most part, we try to stick with just environmental legislation. I have not yet seen a draft of the actual 14001 that's coming out, but I anticipate that there's probably going to be more and more overlaps between the OSHA as well as the EMS requirements. Yes, we do. There's a question about whether we certify to RIOS. We do certify to RIOS. We're also in the process of we're in the last phase of getting our accreditation for the e-Steward standard as well. So as of now, we can do R2 RIOS, and we will be very shortly capable of also auditing to e-Stewards as well. And all these three are really standards for the recycling industry, for the e-waste industry specifically. Well, compared to a 9001 audit, we have to look at, one of the questions was, compared to a 9001 audit, how much extra time does the 14001 audit typically add? If you're looking at it independently, we will find that it sort of depends on a number of factors. One of the key things in 14 that we don't consider for 9 is the risk level. So depending on what impacts the organization has on its environment, the risk level will vary. So a low-risk company is one that really doesn't have many impacts on on the environment. It could be something like a sales office or just a warehouse or an assembly unit. But high risk could be one like a chemical industry where we're talking about huge impacts in the event of an accident or any deviation from the EMS. So it kind of depends on that, but I would say anywhere from 30% to 50% more. And sometimes it's even on par. If it's lower risk, sometimes it's almost the same time as 9001. So it really, really depends, and it's hard to put a definite percentage on how much extra time we would need. The slides will be available. I think it will be available online after you're done with this session. So if in the event you're unable to get a hold of it, certainly feel free to contact me and I can email you the slides. Let me go through the other questions. Somebody wanted an example of other legal requirements. One of the most common ones that we've seen for other requirements are wood packaging rules. So for a lot of companies that ship items across international borders, especially from, let's say, the United States to China or any other place, there are specific treatments that have to be made to the wood packaging that is being used before it's shipped to all these different countries. Most countries are signatories of these rules, so you find that most of the packaging that is shipped comes with a label that says it's been fumigated, and managed in an environmentally sound manner. You can look these up and Google them, and you should be able to pull that up. But that's an example, classic example of an other requirement that's related to an environmental aspect. Another one is RoHS requirements. That's a European requirement when they manufacture electronic equipment and not using certain hazardous metals or substances when making the electronic equipment or components. Can the compliance evaluation be carried on site with another manager, or does it have to be done by an external contractor? There is absolutely no requirement in the standard that says that a third party or an external contractor has to be used. The standard is very clear. If you're using somebody to do the compliance evaluation, as long as you demonstrate that this individual has competence, and you can define what that competence is to conduct such a compliance evaluation, it is permitted to use a lot of companies use their own internal staff or manager to do the work. Certainly it has to be somebody who doesn't necessarily manage the legal requirements on a day-to-day basis, because you want an unbiased look at your own system. So it can be somebody else in the organization that has the competence to be able to conduct it. But once again, there is no requirement that you have to use a third-party individual to conduct a compliance evaluation. One question we have is, will the R2 auditor training offered by R2 Solutions meet the requirements for internal audits for both ISO standards? The R2 auditor training is very specific to the R2 standard, so really it focuses on the requirements of the R2 practices. As far as meeting the requirements for internal auditors, if you're talking about ISO 14001 or 18001, you could start by using the guidance document that I talked about, which is 19011, develop competence for your internal auditors. For the most part, they have to go through at least some kind of an internal auditor program for either ISO 9000 or 14001. R2 will not cover the requirements for 14.9 or 18, so they're kind of independent. The requirements are independent. And keep in mind, R2 is not an ISO standard, so that's also a big difference as far as comparing them to 14 and 18. So most of the organizations will have their internal auditors go through internal auditor training for 14 and 18 separately, and the R2 training would also be separate. But you could start with the 19011 guidance document to identify what that competence requirement is. The new standard for ISO 14001, we've just received the draft for review. We anticipate that it will be released at the end of 2014. They haven't actually established a date, but I anticipate it's probably going to be the end of this year or probably early 2015 when the standard will be released. And typically most companies will be given a year and a half to be able to upgrade to the new standard and make sure that all the deltas are taken care of. still going through the last few questions that we have. We have a question here that says, audit, including internal audits, are processes for evaluation of level and conformity and compliance. Do you think compliance evaluation 4.5.2 shall be considered as part of the internal audit for 14 and 18? And this is where I think the big confusion arises, because a lot of times a company will do an internal audit and have one checkbox for 4.5.2, and they'll say, yes, we've conducted our evaluation to compliance. Unfortunately, that does not meet the requirement, because what the standard is really looking for is trying to see if you meet all the different areas that your environmental legislation says that you have to meet. So if you have an SPCC plan, what are some of the things that you have to meet in order to comply with that SPCC plan? If you have stormwater requirements, what are some of the things that you need to do? So most companies develop a checklist around those requirements, and that's not something that's captured really under the internal audit, because the internal audit will concentrate on 4.1 through 4.6 of the 14,001 standard. But the compliance audit will look at all the fine print that comes under the environmental legislation or other requirements that you have to meet. So you can choose to do it through your regular monitoring and measurement process. There's nothing that says you have to do a separate audit for legislation. If you have a process for continual monitoring of all the parameters that would meet this environmental legislation, you can show us those checklists, whether it's weekly checklists or monthly checklists, and demonstrate that you have a process to take care of it. But most of the time, we find that companies do at least one annual audit or something that's periodic, maybe once in 2 years, that really focuses on all the requirements that go into meeting an environmental legislation. PJR itself, the question we have here is, does PJR offer an internal audit training for 18 and 14? Our sister company, which is PJI, Perry Johnson Incorporated, you can actually go to the website, which is pji.com, basically offers all the training relevant to any of these standards. So certainly we do offer it, but it's not directly through PJR, but rather through PJI. And we do have a full website that details it. We could certainly come on site to your facility and train your entire staff. I've personally conducted a couple in the past where we've trained several employees in an organization, or you could choose to attend one of the internal auditor programs that we have going on through the year. But I think the best way, if you're looking at multiple standards for your company, the best way is probably to have on-site training at your facility. And the last question that I'm going to take is, if compliance evaluation is not part of the internal audit, the internal audit will not check if all legal and self-imposed requirements are met. Then what will the internal audit do exactly? The internal audit actually looks at your PDCA cycle. So it looks at all the requirements from 4.1 through 4.6, whether your policy meets the requirements, whether your list of legal requirements are complete, whether your list of aspects are complete, whether you're investigating your nonconformities. All those things are checked with respect to your EMS itself, but the compliance evaluation, which comes under 4.5.2, is specific only to the federal, state legislation that you have to meet, or any other legal requirements that you have to meet, like other requirements we talked about, RoHS, wood packaging rules, etc. So it's kind of outside of what this one concentrates sort of on the standard, and the other concentrates on regulatory requirements, not the voluntary requirements of the standard. I hope that answers that. We do have to end our session today. It's exactly 11 a.m. or 12 p.m. Eastern. So if you have any other questions, please feel free to email me. I'd be more than happy to take your questions, and we can certainly communicate one-on-one. And I thank you all very much today for attending this session, and we look forward to having you participate in other PGR webinars in the future. Thank you and have a great day.